This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Evie Muir, author of Radical Rest. Evie challenges the myth that burnout can be cured by self-care alone, and offers a bold vision of rest as a communal, transformative practice. We explore how rest and nature exposure can lead us from exhaustion and grief toward joy and resilience, and what it might take to build a world where we can all thrive.
I'm Evie, and I'm a nature writer, founder of Peaks of Colour, which is a Peak District-based nature for healing grassroots community group dying for people of colour. And I am most recently an author of Radical Rest, which still feels really surreal to say. But I guess I came into this work. My background was in the violence against women and girls sector professionally. And I worked in that sector supporting Black and queer survivors of gendered violence for 10 years. And it was there where I burnt out routinely and to a really dangerous capacity, and got to a point where I was really questioning if it would even be possible, if it would even be safe for me to continue doing this kind of work, the survivor-centered work, because of how unsafe it was feeling for me, both in my body and emotionally. And Peaks of Colour and Radical Rest then came from that place, from a really kind of hopeful but also desperate place of needing to find alternative ways of doing this work, of doing the work that I was really passionate about and really loved, but recognizing that, we needed infrastructures and systems that held us while we were doing it. Because for the most part, those of us in these roles and in these movements are survivors ourselves of the many different social violences that are being inflicted upon us. So we're in this really kind of turbulent situation where we're both the recipients of the societal harm and those fighting it. And therefore we need care ourselves in the process. So that's kind of where I find myself at the minute, still tentatively and earnestly trying to reimagine this work essentially so that we can continue fighting towards racial, gendered and land justice and a liberated future, but making sure that that journey isn't one that kills us along the way.
There's a lot of things that you said there that we will go on to talk about, I'm sure, but taking a step back. So you said that you've shifted the way that you work as a self-protection mechanism, but also, presumably so that you can keep on doing good work without affecting yourself and everyone around you. So is it the shift in your work outdoors that has kind of been the pivotal change that you've made?
That's been a huge part of it for sure. And I think the original motivation for us doing this work outside and it being nature-based was simply from that place of, I realised that actually nature had been so instrumental in my own healing, just on a personal level, that I really wanted to share that with my community and invite other people into that experience too. But in terms of that nature allyship, that being a practice that we kind of orient our work around, that really fell into place quite organically and quite naturally. And I think there's something about the more that we spend time in nature, the more that we feel connected to nature, the more that we feel part of nature, those kind of directions and avenues that it shows for us open up. And we've been just gradually experimenting with these nature-based practices of how can we look to nature to reimagine these structures that for generations have been capitalist and based on this kind of capitalist time frame, this capitalist clock. And if we were to try and reimagine them through a nature allied lens, what would that look like? And I know There's other organisations, for example, doing that reimagining through different lenses. Maya, which is an organisation in Birmingham, for example, springs to mind immediately because they're doing that reimagining work through a like solar and space-based lens. But for us, being based in Sheffield and having such a close proximity to the Peak District, a nature-based model felt really apt and relevant and timely. And I suppose one example of that is that we organise seasonally. So rather than this capitalist kind of framework, which tells us that we have to be on all the time and productive all the time and energized all the time, we recognize that there are periods of abundance and periods of rest that need to happen. So around this time every year, we go into hibernation and yeah, we consider what that hibernation looks like for us each year. And as we've been growing, we've recognized that hibernation isn't this like inactive place where we just do nothing. And I mean, I suffer from seasonal depression really badly. So that's usually my instinct is just to kind of fall off the radar and wallow in my own feelings and what's going on for me. But actually, when we consider hibernation as that like organizing tool and political tool, it kind of opens up all these possibilities of what it means to do this work out of sight and unseen, and what it means to like consolidate this work and nourish this work and have time to plan and have time to vision rather than always being concerned with delivery and outputs and being visible on social media and being visible for funders. Actually, these few months of hibernation is when we actually remind ourselves of who we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, yeah, that's one example of how nature plays a part.
Well, I mean, my kind of day job is in horticultural therapy, so that really resonates with me. You know, you can set out a plan and say, we're going to do this activity this day, and then it's absolutely soaking wet, or everyone turns up and they're cold, and it just all goes out the window, and yet there is that pressure on you. So that's really, really good to know that you're just going, actually, why are we doing that? Let's re-examine that. And I love the fact that in the book you said that you've incorporated unprofessionalism into the core principles of Peaks of Colour. I think that's just brilliant. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose that as a principle came from those decades of working in the charity sector and the way that professionalism has been woven into that work that in terms of a really long story short, the charity sector as a model is an institution that we're told as organisers is the place for us. If you're passionate about something, if you care about something, if you want to fix something in society, work in the charity sector, and this is how you'll do it. But actually, the charity sector is it's a capitalist system. It's built and was originally built to serve capitalism rather than to serve those in need. And when we kind of hold that history and hold that context and hold how that manifests today through funders and through systems of oppression, you can kind of see how those histories filter down into day-to-day practice and how they impact those working within the system and those supposedly receiving care and support in the system. And as someone who was in a professional role, what I found is that I was in that role where I was advocating for survivors and fighting for survivors to be able to access healing and justice, or at least what capitalism tells us is healing and justice. Yet you were meant to do that professionally. You were meant to do it politely. You were meant to be navigating these systems and all these really powerful institutions and powerful figures who are able to dictate whether or not someone receives care. And as that kind of cog in the wheel, you're meant to be polite about it. You're meant to follow the rules. And then you're that person who relays back to the survivors that, oh no, this isn't possible for you time and time again. Oh no, your perpetrator has gotten away with this. Oh no, you're not going to get these protections. And we're just meant to be palatable in this process. And often that is in the face of abject racism and white supremacy. It is in the face of ableism, transphobia, homophobia, and Islamophobia. And we're not allowed to react in the way that those harms warrant. So, in being able to create my own space and own organisation, I was so conscious that I or anyone who works with us isn't expected to silence themselves in the face of harm and in the face of oppression. And no matter how big or small, because there are so many of these little injustices of the ways that we police ourselves, of the ways we silence ourselves, and of the ways we accommodate people and situations that simply aren't safe for us. And so we kind of made it that kind of blanket rule that if someone or something or a system is kind of purposefully and intentionally harming us, we will name it, we will say it, and we won't bite our tongue anymore. And when we're able to use our voice in that way, it means that that resentment isn't being internalized, that anger isn't being internalized, because I realized that I was carrying essentially 10 years of anger towards majoritively white, powerful people who had the power to hold a space that was just kind of electric with control. And in spaces like that, all that happens is that when you feel like you can't speak, you go away and you kind of have those arguments in your head later, and that kind of shame and self-loathing that's associated with, oh, I should have said that, I should have stuck up for myself, I shouldn't have agreed to this. It sits within you and it becomes this embodied pain. So yeah, unprofessionalism as a principle is essentially saying, well, we're not going to do that anymore. And I think what it's meant is that the right people, the people who really care for this work and really respect this work, will stay around even when we voice an opinion that they don't like. So, it really kind of filters out those people who are only in this work because of ego or because they want to be associated and piggyback off our work, if they're not actually willing to look at themselves and do that kind of internalized work. And we currently don't have the capacity to work alongside them.
That's a very brave position, and it takes a lot of courage to speak out when you feel like things aren't being done right, especially if you're getting funded by the very people that you're kind of, shining a light on. It's a very brave thing to do. The book itself is called Radical Rest, and you talk about that in the book. What does that mean to you?
For me, it really is just a lens in which we can view this work, and a practice that we can keep returning to and keep implementing and keep grounded in as we do this work. And I think for me, rest shouldn't be radical at all. And the only reason it is because in order to look after ourselves, care for ourselves, center ourselves in this work within a capitalist and white supremacist system, that is currently radical. But the hope is that generations from now, our grandkids will pick up this book like it's some ancient text in the library and read it and be like, God, weren't our ancestors so knackered? Because we've currently, in our present, we're laying the foundations for a restful future, which means the generations that come after us won't be experiencing burnout at such a chronic state, won't be experiencing the embodied effects of intergenerational trauma, and that if we can kind of short circuit that now, that burnout won't become a generational embodied trauma that is carried on, that we pass on to future generations. So I think for me, radical rest as a practice is that kind of interruption of taking stock of where we are now, of recognizing what has caused us to get to where we are, and what it is that we need in the present that allows us to build these futures that are no longer painful, exhausting, traumatizing. And that equally shines a light on the systems that are causing burnout as a harm, and really allow us to take stock of, okay, what is it that we need now? What is it that we need to resist? And what is it that we need to build to ensure that this isn't just the status quo for years to come?
Part of the problem, I think, is that you talk about in the book, is that there's this disconnection from nature. And I don't think that I can think of anyone who would dispute that that is a fact. But kind of taking that one step further, do you feel that there's almost a deliberate intention to disconnect us from nature for whatever reason? I mean, I think you intimate that in the book, but what's your feelings around that?
I definitely agree with you. I think when you look at any social issue through the lens of burnout and through the lens of rest, it becomes quite clear where those structural intentions lie. And suddenly we can then see that actually, when we are connected to nature, we're more connected to our bodies, we're more connected to the earth, we feel more responsibility towards the earth, we can identify our own needs. When we're connecting to nature in community, we are able to hold those needs and those responsibilities together, and we feel this mutual connection to both ourselves, each other, and the environment. And that builds this relationship, which I think then has this ripple effect of, you're not going to treat each other badly, treat your body badly, or treat the earth badly because you love it, because you care for it. Anything that you care for, you won't disrespect. And anything that you care for, you will fight for. And I think like a mechanism of capitalism is that disconnect. It disconnects us from ourselves. So then when we don't care for ourselves, we can't fight for ourselves. It disconnects us from each other. So when we're seeing our neighbours or another community that may be ours or that we may not feel a part of be systemically harmed, we're not going to advocate for them. We're not going to fight alongside them. And it disconnects us from the land. So when we're seeing this global environmental injustice happening, we feel powerless to do something about that. And I think what that does, it's almost like a package deal of making us feel powerless, making us feel like we have no agency, like we don't have a voice, and like that we can't determine what presents and futures exist for us. Like we're just things that are done to, as opposed to something being people and agents of change. And then, therefore, when you kind of look at burnout through that lens, it makes sense that there's like powers that be would want us to be burnt out, because when we're burnt out, we're inactive. You are completely exhausted, completely on the floor. And even if you wanted to, you have no energy to get up and fight. So then it almost sounds conspiracy theory-ish. I recognize that. But considering, oh, how is this current state that I'm in? How is this current state that the world's in? How is the current state that my local environment is in, my global environment is in, serving the systems that only exist for profit, gain, and domination? And when you can kind of reframe it in that way, we can see that actually our healing is revolutionary. The care that we have for our bodies, each other, and the land is revolutionary. Our fight for global justice and against global injustice is revolutionary. And these kind of everyday acts build into something bigger. So, yeah, I definitely think that our exhaustion and our trauma only serves our oppressors.
And I wonder as well if there's a kind of conditions that we place on ourselves, and they may well be as a result of conditioning that's come from a larger source. But thinking about access to the land, I mean, I can only speak from my experience and, where I live. But as a woman walking through the countryside on my own, I worry. I'm not going to lie. I don't feel necessarily that secure walking on my own. But I can pretty much bet that everybody listening will have some issue that they kind of imposed on themselves or that's real about actually getting access to the land and moving within it. Does that come from society rather than kind of powers that be, do you think? And is that something that we need to think about?
Yeah, I definitely think like there are almost degrees and levels and just a lot of intersecting factors that contribute to any social injustice. So there will invariably be that layer of personal trauma and personal fear that may have stemmed from lived experience and therefore is like entirely valid. But similarly, there may be this kind of like fear mongering through the media that tells us that none of our streets are safe and none of our outdoor spaces are safe, but comes through this lens of, women must stay inside to therefore be safe, as opposed to men need to stop harassing and violating and terrorizing women on the street. It's these kind of narratives that all contribute to a fear and a feeling of unsafety, but also then, similarly in terms of like land access and race, it's then there is that kind of real and valid lived experience of experiencing racism in the outdoors, everything from driving through country lanes and seeing St. George's flags to in the Peak District during lockdown, there was a right-wing movement. They go by Patriotic Alternative, and they marched along Mantor, which is one of the most popular Peak District locations, brandishing a White Lives Matter banner. So, there's that real lived experience that infuses us with fear. But then there are also these kind of societal systems that tell us that the only way we can access the outdoors is in certain ways, and that you have to look like this outdoorsy person who's only wearing like green and brown and branded items, and you have to have all the gear, and if you don't look a certain way, you're not going to be welcome. And that is reinforced by large brands, large institutions, places like the National Trust and English Heritage reinforce that idea of what it means to connect with nature. And actually, through both a gendered and a racialized lens, there really has to be that kind of 360 moment where we consider what nature connection actually would look like to us if we were able to feel safe and feel like we were able to have a stake in what that meant. And I think in many ways that would look like a reimagining and returning to Indigenous land practices, both from our ancestral lands, but also Indigenous land practices here in the UK as well. And I think that would then spark so much more excitement and interest, because again, it's not that we're being told that we have to engage with nature in these very small, very controlled and packaged ways. It's that actually we can develop a relationship with nature that connects us with our grandparents or connects us with the children within us that like to play and frolic or didn't get the opportunity to do that. So, yeah, I think for me, it's finding those alternative ways and alternative spaces that allow us to build a relationship with nature on our own terms.
Thank you very much to Evie for taking part in the interview and for bringing her perspective. And thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 242, Soil, the story of a Black mother's garden, and episode 86, with Nicole Rose of Solidarity Apothecary. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.